but such is the book of Revelation. But truth be told, we've already talked a lot about chapter 17 in our study of chapter 13, because chapter 17 is an angel's explanation of what the symbolism in chapter 13 means. So thinking back a few months ago when we looked at chapter 13, we not only looked at that chapter, we also looked at chapter 17, we looked at Daniel chapter 7, and 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. It's a very intricate piece of prophecy that connects together a lot of different passages in both the Old and New Testament. So some of tonight will be review of what we talked about a couple of months ago, and some of it will be the material we didn't get to in chapter 17. And then chapter 18 is just basically a commentary on the harlot Babylon and sort of the lamentation that the world expresses for her fall. But before we get into that, let's just do a little bit of review from last night. We were talking about the 6th and 7th bowls of wrath in chapter 16. And as I shared with you last night, I believe bowl number 6 represents the decline and fall of the Ottoman Empire. This happened gradually over a period of a couple hundred years. And the decline of the Ottoman Empire makes way for the modern kingdoms of the Middle East. Once that empire had fallen at the hands of the British and the French divided that conquered territory up into the modern nations that we have in the Middle East today. We also talked about how at the same time that this decline was happening, there were a lot of dangerous doctrines, dangerous philosophies, dangerous ideologies that were emanating from the European continent. We talked about how the decline of the Ottoman Empire put together with the false doctrines, the unclean spirits that went out into the world, that these factors worked together in order to gather the nations against God for that final day, that final battle called Armageddon. So bowl number 6 is a very relevant bowl because it happened within the last 100 years. And so did bowl number 7. And I just want to apologize as I get to this slide because some of you are following along in the note packet and you're not going to see this particular slide in the note packet. I sent Ginger all of these notes last week, and when I was going back into them today, I added a couple of slides, so please forgive me. There are a couple of things that needed to be clarified. So, bowl number 7, we talked about last night, represents the 2 world wars, and I think in particular the Second World War is probably what is intended. And as we read Neil Ferguson, the historian from the Hoover Institute at Stanford last night, who wrote this great book about this time period, he called it the greatest catastrophe in human history, and I think all of us would probably agree with that. Probably a lot of us have seen the movies that have been made about World War II. We've seen documentaries about this war, and I think we can agree that the loss of life combined with the Holocaust, combined with the brutality, combined with the destruction, World War II is an unparalleled event in human history. And that's one of the comments that's made about the 7th bowl, that there was an earthquake, and such an earthquake had never been seen before in the history of humanity. The hailstones that were falling from heaven weighing a talent seemed to foreshadow the extensive damage from artillery and bombs across Europe. And we looked at that little map that was basically a video compilation year by year showing the bombings in Europe and then over in the Pacific. But we focused in on that European continent and noticed the amount of bombs that were dropped on what we might call the throne of the beast, the very place where the beast power was seated for over 1,000 years. And out of this momentous event, a new world order emerges, because the world that exists after World War II is far different than the world that existed prior to that point. And we could get into some of the the decisions that were made in the final days of World War II and why those changes were made and how that was different, but that seems like that's a different discussion for a different time. The last thing we noticed in that seventh bowl is that rather than repent, this event caused men to curse God. And this is where we left off last night. I felt compelled to go back to the C.S. Lewis quotes because I kind of had to rush through the first one, but I think C.S. Lewis has a good perspective. He, of course, was an atheist. He converted to a flavor of Christianity and became a real defender of the Christian faith in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So he lived in this time period. He saw what things were like on the European continent before these things happened. And in 1953, he penned a series of letters called the Latin Letters. And this is what he has to say, reflecting back on the Second World War and what had transpired since then. But this did not happen without sins on our part. For that justice and that care for the poor, which most mendaciously the communists advertised, we in reality ought to have brought about ages ago. Basically what he's admitting in that statement is the communists have had a point. We have not taken care of the poor as we should have. Continuing on, but far from it, we Westerners preach Christ with our lips, with our actions we brought the slavery of mammon. So he's decrying the materialism that has come to characterize Western culture. And of course, that hasn't changed very much. He's basically saying Western culture has been a bunch of hypocrites. We've preached Christ with our lips, but we have pursued money. We have been greedy. Continuing on, we are more guilty than the infidels. For to those that know the will of God and do not do it, the greater the punishment. Now the only refuge lies in contrition and prayer. Long have we erred. In reading the history of Europe, its destructive succession of wars, of avarice, or fratricidal persecutions of Christians by Christians, that's something we talked about a lot in earlier chapters of Revelation, of luxury, of gluttony, of pride. Who could detect any but the rarest traces of the Holy Spirit? Basically, he's just talking about how for centuries now Europe has claimed Christianity, but has not reflected it in its actions. They have been talking one way and living quite the opposite. In a letter later written in that same year, 1953, he says this, I certainly feel that very grave dangers hang over us. This results from the great apostasy of the great part of Europe from the Christian faith. Hence a worse state than the one we were in before we received the faith. Let me pause there. Here he's beginning to recall the words of Peter at the end of the second chapter of 2 Peter, when Peter is talking about those who once knew God, who once were enlightened, but they have departed from the faith. And Peter says that the state of that person is worse than at the first. They are worse off now, having departed from the faith, than having never known Jesus to begin with. That's what C.S. Lewis is recalling. For no one returns from Christianity to the same state he was in before Christianity, but into a worse state. The difference between a pagan and an apostate is the difference between an unmarried woman and an adulteress. Therefore, many men of our time have lost not only the supernatural light, but also the natural light which the pagans possess. He's basically saying that the European continent is a spiritual tomb, and that now we are worse off than we were back in pagan times, back when our tribes were pagan in orientation. So I think that this gives a good summary of that whole idea of men blaspheming God, the atheism and the humanism that came as a result of the Second World War, I think fits that piece of the prophecy very, very well. Let's get into chapter 17, otherwise I may never get through this presentation tonight. Here we go. Chapter 17, verses 1 and 2. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with me, saying, Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Those of you who have been with us now for a few months recall that I've summed up Revelation in many different ways, but one of the ways that I've summed it up is Revelation is a tale of two women. You have the chaste virgin in chapter 12 who is clothed with heavenly glory, who gives birth to the male child. This represents the people of God bringing the Messiah into the world. And after the dragon opposes the Messiah, tries to kill him, the dragon is cast out of heaven. He persecutes God's people, drives them into the wilderness where God has created a refuge for them. This woman represents the people of God. The people of God prior to Jesus, the Jewish people with whom God had a covenant relationship. And then after Jesus, after his resurrection and ascension to the right hand of God, that woman represents the church. But that woman is contrasted with this woman in chapter 17, a woman who is called a harlot, who is the mother of harlots. And this woman represents apostasy. She represents rebellion against God. So you have two women in the book of Revelation, and you also have two cities. With apologies to Mr. Dickens, Revelation is also a tale of two cities. You have in chapter 11, verse number 2, the holy city, the heavenly Jerusalem, that's identified later in chapter 21, verse number 2. And then you also have what's called the great city. The holy city and the great city are two different cities. The great city is manifest in places like Sodom. It's manifest in places like Egypt and Jerusalem and Babylon. These are representative, once again, of the rebellion of mankind against God's directives. And I think each of those examples, you can see how they would be examples of that very thing. So Revelation is a tale of two women. It's a tale of two cities. Let's talk about this woman a little bit more. And in the 17th chapter, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the 17th chapter is an angel's interpretation of the harlot and the beast. And I'm very thankful for this. Otherwise, we would be left to guess and to fill in the blanks on our own. So this is one of those instances where God interprets the symbolism for us so that we aren't left to guess, at least not in entirety. All right, let's read some more about this woman here in verses 3 through 6. So the angel carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. So here we have two entities. We have a beast and we have a harlot. And the beast is that same beast we met back in chapter 13. To see all this, John is carried by the angel into the wilderness. And remember, the wilderness represents a sanctuary for God's people. So John is basically taken away to this sanctuary in order to better understand some of the things that he's seen in these various visions. And there he sees a scarlet beast. And I want you to notice that word scarlet. It's a scarlet beast having 7 heads and 10 horns. That's going to sound familiar. That's that same beast back from chapter 13. That beast that represents an earthly power. In this case, it represents the Latin kingdom. That Latin kingdom that is identified by the number 666, which when spelled out in the Greek language spells out the word Latinos, the Latin kingdom. It's a scarlet beast because scarlet is one of the colors of royalty. It's also the color of the dragon in chapter 12, verse 3. And if you think back to our study of chapters 12 and 13, you'll remember that the dragon has 7 heads and 10 horns, and the beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. The dragon is a red dragon. The beast is a scarlet beast. So the beast is a manifestation of Satan's power in the world. Satan works through the kingdoms of this world in order to accomplish his purpose. That's the message that's being communicated to us. But this woman, this harlot, is sitting on the heads. sitting on the scarlet beast, verse 3. And what I think that represents is the beast is subservient to the woman. She is in a position of power, in a position of authority. She is directing the beast wherever it will go. She herself is clothed in purple and scarlet, so she is clothed as a queen. In fact, in chapter 18, she's going to call herself a queen. And in her hand, she holds a golden cup. And it's with this golden cup she seduces and intoxicates the nations of this world. So you might think of that as being representative of her doctrine, of her ideology, that she draws people in and puts them under her spell, so to speak. That's the sort of imagery that the Lord is getting across to us. And she's given this name, Mystery Babylon the Great. Babylon, of course, takes us back to Genesis chapter 11, to the Tower of Babel. And the Tower of Babel is the first recorded rebellion against God after the flood. After the flood, mankind is united by a single language. Everybody is sticking together. It appears, or at least it's inferred, or implied, I should say. It's implied that they're led by a man named Nimrod, who builds not only Babylon, but builds a few other cities as well. Nimrod appears to be sort of an archetype for the ungodly king. And you see that archetype pop up in other places in the Old Testament in particular. But here, Babylon itself is used as an archetype. So it's prefiguring a spirit. It's the spirit of Babylon that's coming out in Europe. So the same spirit of rebellion that was present when mankind united to build this city and this tower, that same spirit is present in this woman. That's what God is driving home. The great city Babylon has popped up in places like Sodom and Egypt and Jerusalem. By Jerusalem, I mean the Jerusalem that crucified Jesus, the Jerusalem that rejected Jesus as their Messiah. In verse 24, in this harlot Babylon was found the blood of the prophets and saints and of all who were slain on the earth. So she is held responsible for the persecution of God's people for all time. So it's the spirit of apostasy, the spirit of rebellion, the spirit that leads people who think that they're doing God's will, but in fact are rebelling against him, even to the point that they will kill their so-called fellow Christians. In the book of Revelation, Babylon, or Rome, I should say, is the manifestation of Babylon. Later on in the 17th chapter, verse 18, the woman who you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. So what you have here is a spirit that just continues to pop up in different places all throughout human history. It's been in Babel, it's been in Sodom, it's been in Egypt, it's been in Jerusalem. Now it's popped up in Rome. And what this woman represents basically is allegiance to the beast. Let's keep moving here. Chapter 17, verses 7 through 11. And I know this may seem a little bit abstract, and I understand that, but when you get into talking about symbolism, I'm just not sure how concrete we really can be in either our explanations or our understanding. We are kind of out on the edge of abstraction here. Chapter 17, beginning in verse number 7. So remember, in verse 6, John was amazed by what he just saw. The angel sort of rebukes him. He asks, "Why did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition." Now, for those of you that have been with us the last few months, this is going to sound very familiar. We were talking about all this back in chapter 13. So let's just take a moment to review this beast and what all these individual details represent. I believe the 7 heads of this beast represent the various stages of Roman power. The angel says that 5 have fallen. Remember, Rome, the Roman kingdom, existed in some form for over 2,000 years. So it went through phases. It went through an evolution, so to speak. And at John's day, 5 of these heads have fallen. 5 stages of power have passed. But John is alive during one of those heads, and that head is, of course, the principates, the emperors of Rome who rule from Rome in the west. This is the time period from Augustus, Octavian, until Diocletian in the latter part of the 3rd century. So this is the ruling head at this time period. He says the other head has not yet come, but he will endure for a short time. And we talked about how this seems to represent Constantine and the new form, if you will, of Roman government that he brought following the reign of Diocletian. So Constantine to the fall of Rome in the west. It's going to endure for a short time. Now, I just want to point this out. 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Let's all remember that Rome was known as the city of 7 hills. So there's some geographical connection with the symbolism as well. All right, so the beast seems to represent this Latin kingdom, this Latin power. But there's an 8th part. The beast himself is also the 8th and is of the 7. One of the interesting things that you can see in history is that while the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, out of its ashes arose this new power, what we call the Catholic Church. You could call it the Latin Church. You could call it the Church of Rome. We best know it as the Catholic Church. And as we read, a couple of different historians noted that the Catholic Church, all of its infrastructure, its hierarchy, the priests and the cardinals and the bishops, that entire organization was basically adapted from the Roman Empire bureaucracy. So Rome became the Catholic Church, or should I say the Catholic Church took these elements out of Rome and adopted them for herself. So that hierarchy, that form of government, if you will, became religious in its orientation. This, I believe, is the 8th. We also talked about these 10 horns a couple of months ago. The 10 horns represent those European nations that emerged from the Roman Empire. We know them by names like France and England and Switzerland and Germany and Austria and Poland, but they weren't always known by those names. But those powers emerged after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. A few more things about the beast. Again, this is more of some of the things that we talked about earlier in chapter 13. The beast emerges from the bottomless pit. We learned that back in chapter 11, verse number 7. When the beast opposes these 2 witnesses, that beast ascends out of the bottomless pit, which once again connects the beast together with Satan, that the beast is the manifestation of Satan's power in the world. It's the tool that Satan uses to oppose God, to oppose his church. That's what I just said. Yeah, there we go. I jumped ahead of myself there on those bullets. Chapter 13, verse number 2, the dragon gave the beast his power, his throne, and great authority. But we are assured in the 17th chapter that beast comes out of the bottomless pit. The beast is going to perdition. This is an important detail. Perdition just simply means destruction. It means judgment. And what we learn later in chapter 19, verse number 20, is this beast continues to exist all the way to the day of Armageddon. In chapter 19, verse number 20, Jesus and his armies captured the beast and with him the false prophet who worked signs in his presence by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. These 2 were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone. He is cast into perdition. This is God's judgment, God's fiery judgment. So I believe that this beast is going to continue to exist all the way until Jesus' return. And he's going to play an important role in bringing the nations of the world against the Lord. All right. Chapter 17, verses 12 through 14. I don't know. I may not get through chapter 18. We'll see. I was feeling optimistic earlier tonight. I'm not so sure anymore. Here we go. Chapter 17, verse 12. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet. They receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind. They will give their power and authority to the beast. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. These horns represent the European kingdoms, the kingdoms that emerged following the decline and fall of the Western Roman Empire. And as the angel tells us, these kingdoms subjected themselves to the authority of the Catholic Church. As the angel states, these are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. These kingdoms allowed the Catholic Church to persecute dissenting views of Christianity. We talked about the persecution of so-called heretics in the Middle Ages, where the Catholic Church leaned on the local authorities to carry out that persecution to begin with. But later on, it invented this thing it called the Inquisition, and it used tools like this basically to stamp out any dissenting views. If you did not accept the authority of the Catholic Church, if you didn't accept the authority of the priest, if you did not accept the authority of the papacy, if you just wanted to open the Bible and read it in your own language and understand it, you were considered a heretic. As the angel says, these kingdoms will make war with the Lamb. And I want you to notice, we talked a lot about these kingdoms making war against the church, but I want you to notice they make war with the Lamb. And that reminds me of something that Jesus said to his apostles. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they reject you, they're not really rejecting you. Who are they rejecting? They're rejecting Jesus, right? So any persecution against the church is really a persecution of Jesus himself. So you have them making war with the Lamb. You also have them making war with the saints to overcome them, back in chapter 13, verse number 7. Pushing on. I'm getting more and more optimistic every time I hit a slide. Here we go. Chapter 17, verse 15. Then he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. For God has put into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman who you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. So he says these nations, these kingdoms, will come to hate the harlot. So the Catholic Church claimed ultimate authority over the peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues across the whole world. And we talked about how once Europe began sending ships out and colonizing places like South America and Southeast Asia, that the Catholic Church began to assert its authority in more and more places. And the kingdoms of Europe cooperated with the Catholic Church for a time. They gave their kingdom over to the beast, but ultimately, each one of these kingdoms threw off the yoke of Catholicism. We talked about the Protestant Reformation in trumpet number 6. We talked about the French Revolution in bowl number 1. We discussed the Italian unification, which was symbolized by bowl number 5. Each one of these is an important moment. Each one of these is basically the nations of Europe saying, we're done with you. We're not going to have the same relationship with you any longer. And indeed, that is the case. As we've discussed a couple of different times, the last couple of nights, Europe really is a spiritual tomb. To this day. I was listening to a podcaster the other day who had visited Europe many times, and he basically said Europe is a museum filled with people that just don't seem all that excited to be alive. I don't know if that's been your experience, those of you who have visited Europe, but that was his take, and there may be some truth to that. Anyways, let's continue on in chapter 18, verse number 1. After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. For all the nations have drunk the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. This is a lamentation. Well, it's not really a lamentation in this case. In this case, it's basically a commentary on what has happened. So what's interesting about this angel is he descends, he illuminates the earth with heavenly glory. And I think that that's an important little detail that can be easily overlooked. Basically what the angel is doing is he's casting light to drive out the darkness. He's exposing this harlot for what she is. And that puts me in mind of passages like Ephesians 5:13. But all things that are exposed are made manifest by the light, for whatever makes manifest is light. And Jesus' words about light and darkness in chapter 3 of John, verses 19 through 21. For everyone who practicing evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deed should be exposed. That's John 3:20. So here you've got this angel illuminating the earth with heavenly glory. He is exposing the deeds, the misdeeds of this great harlot. And we have a fulfillment of what was declared back in chapter 14, verse number 8. Chapter 14 is a prediction of what's going to happen. And that's happened in the 7 bowls of wrath in between chapter 14 and chapter 18. Now we're reflecting back on the reduction of Babylon. So with the 7th bowl, the Catholic Church and the kingdoms of Europe are basically a shell of their former selves. So these kingdoms that cooperated together with the beast, that had the mark of the beast on their forehead, on their right hands, they pledged their allegiance to them. They have gone through this judgment of God executed over a period of about 150 years. And they are just not what they once were. They became a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. So this basically points to moral decay and spiritual corruption. Chapter 18, verse number 4. And this is something that I mentioned back in chapter 13. There's an invitation here that I think is really important to note, and we'll talk some more about it on the next slide. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. For her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay her double according to her works. In the cup which she has mix double for her. In the measure that she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow. For she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, and am no widow, and will not see sorrow. Therefore her plagues will come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire. For strong is the Lord God who judges her. The invitation is in that 4th verse. Come out of her, my people. This is an echo of something that God says to the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 51. And remember, Jeremiah was living during the time when Jerusalem was in its last days. The Babylonians were progressively conquering Judah and Jerusalem more and more until finally it fell in 586. And in Jeremiah 51, there's this invitation. My people, go out of the midst of her and let everyone deliver himself from the fierce anger of the Lord. Remember, Babylon carried Judah captive back to the land of Babylon, and they were to serve their sentence for 70 years. But God wants them to return. Come out of her, my people. Deliver himself from the fierce anger of the Lord. It's that same sort of invitation. So you have people who have been corrupted by this apostasy, and there remains hope for them. I don't know about you, but I know several people who have converted from Catholicism down through the years. There are people who will begin to see this system, this kingdom, this Latin church for what it really is. We should hold out hope that there are people who will come to the Lord even to this day. This is an echo of chapter 13, verse number 9. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. So listen to the warnings of Scripture. Heed the warning of chapter 14, verses 9 through 11. In those three verses, God warns, if you cooperate, if you go along with the beast, if you allow the beast to take ownership of you, if you become a part of Babylon, there's only one destiny for you, and that's fire and brimstone. That's how this whole thing is going to end. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. Listen. Because the faithful will be rewarded. Those who resist the beast, those who do not give in, those who keep themselves clean and pure, they will be rewarded. Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. So this is a call to repent, a call to be sanctified. And as I was thinking about this earlier today, it reminded me of what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 through 18, where he warns about being unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? And I could go on, but we're running out of time. Same sort of idea. Repay her double, because her sins have reached to heaven. You might remember in the description of the city of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, verse number 4, they were building a city with a tower that reached into the heavens, right? So you can just sort of imagine the sins of Babylon have just piled up like that proverbial Tower of Babel. It has reached to heaven. So it wasn't a building that reached to heaven, but rather their sins. And this passage just put me in mind of what Paul says in Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 and 8. Whatever you sow, that is what you will reap. And that's certainly the case with the harlot. But she is living, I guess you might say, in sort of disbelief, like she's denying reality. I stood as queen, I am no widow, and will not see sorrow. So God has judged her. He has judged her harshly. All kinds of terrible things have happened to her, including that terrible Second World War. And I didn't mention this earlier, but this just came to mind. Are you aware that the Pope who ruled during the Second World War never once denounced the Holocaust? Not one single time. And we know for certain that he knew the Holocaust was happening. He never once said a word. And in fact, the Catholic Church, at least elements within the Catholic Church, cooperated with the Nazis because they were basically playing a political game. They figured fascism was better than communism. Communism was atheist. It was secular. It was intent on destroying all religion, whereas fascism, at least was paying lip service to Christianity in some way. This is just not a good reflection on this particular body. And that's the sort of denial that I think fits with this piece of imagery. This harlot is blinded by pride. And this is basically just an echo of Isaiah 47, verses 7 through 10, which is once again talking about the ancient city of Babylon. And you said, I shall be a lady forever, so that you did not take these things to heart, nor remember the latter end of them. Therefore hear this now, you who are given to pleasures, who dwell securely, who say in your heart, I am, and there is no one else besides me. I shall not sit as a widow, nor shall I know the loss of children. But these two things shall come to you in a moment, in one day. The loss of children and widowhood, they shall come upon you in their fullness because of the multitude of your sorceries, for the great abundance of your enchantments. For you have trusted in your wickedness. You have said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge have warped you. And you have said in your heart, I am, and there is no one else besides me. This is talking about the physical, the actual city of Babylon. This is Isaiah prophesying about basically Babylon denying what's about to happen. And what's interesting is, remember, Babylon fell in what? It fell in a single day. Do you remember that? It's a story in Daniel chapter 5. I think Mark may be taking you through the book of Daniel right now. But the story in Daniel chapter 5 is you have the last king of Babylon throwing a feast. And that night, he's got some priests that decide they're tired of this king, so they open up the gates and let the Medo-Persian army in, and Babylon falls in a single day, just as Isaiah predicted. So it's that same sort of denial that they cannot be defeated, that they will always be in this position. It's that same spirit that's manifest in the Catholic Church. In Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 17 and 18, Jeremiah is talking about the consequences for Jerusalem and Judah. Remember, Jerusalem and Judah were caught up in apostasy, right? And God says, my eyes are on all their ways. They are not hidden from my face, nor is their iniquity hidden from my eyes. And first I will repay double for their iniquity and their sin, because they have defiled my land. They have filled my inheritance with the carcasses of their detestable and abominable idols. God does not put up with apostasy. And he makes sure those who are responsible for it pay, and pay dearly. Chapter 18, verse number 9. Got to get moving here. The kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. So here you have the kings of the earth. Now they are mourning. Now they are lamenting the fall of Babylon, because they had a very beneficial relationship with the Latin Church. The monarchies of Europe benefited from the Latin Church. They worked hand in glove for centuries. But they eventually abandoned Babylon. That's what's depicted for us in bowl number 7. Chapter 16, verses 19 and 20, and great Babylon was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Then every island fled away and the mountains were not found. That idea of the islands fleeing away and the mountains not being found, that basically represents the nations abandoning Babylon. It's commented again in chapter 17, verse 16. The 10 horns, those 10 European kingdoms, which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. It seems to me that they continue with this disdain for the Catholic Church even to our present moment. In chapter 18, verses 11 through 14, the angel continues to comment about the fall of Babylon. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore, merchandise of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple, silk and scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every kind of object of ivory, every kind of object of most precious wood, bronze, iron and marble and cinnamon and incense, fragrant oil and frankincense, wine and oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and bodies and souls of men. The fruit of your soul longed for has gone from you, and all of the things which are rich and splendid have gone from you, and you shall find them no more at all. You might remember back in chapter 13, we talked about how the Catholic Church, if you weren't with the program, if you were a heretic, if you were a dissenter in any sort of way, they restricted what you were able to do in society. That second beast in Revelation chapter 13, this is the one who causes people to not be able to buy or sell. You had to have the mark of the beast. Remember, a mark represents allegiance or ownership. So if you did not go along with the program, if you were a heretic, if you were a Jew, if you were a Muslim, if you were of any other stripe of either Christianity or any other faith within Europe, you basically were excluded from society, including commerce. That mark 666 again represents the Latinos, the word Latinos, the Latin Empire, the Latin Church, the Church of Rome, and the Catholic Church. And as we go back to chapter 13, remember, this beast was controlling the financial system of Europe. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, that no one may buy or sell except the one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. Its number is 666. And this had a real lasting economic impact. People were profiting off of their allegiance, over their alliance with the beast. But if you didn't go along with it, this carried with it a lasting economic impact. We didn't talk much about the Spanish Inquisition. It was a fairly significant event in European history. It lasted for a little over 300 years, 1478 to 1834. And one of the interesting things is we still have about 67,000 records from the Spanish Inquisition that we can go back and review and find out what exactly was happening in this persecution of heresy. In those documents, we find that people were fined, their property was confiscated, the guilty were shunned from society. And a study was done by the University of Sydney recently of these regions of Spain where the Inquisition was the heaviest. And this is what they found. While the suffering of the accused and convicted was the single most important result of persecution, our findings suggest its effects live on. Even now, 200 years on from the Spanish Inquisition, the locations affected appear to be poorer, more religious, less educated, and less trusting. That's quite a statement. So here you have a sense of just how far the reach was of the Catholic Church. Not only were they suppressing people a couple hundred years ago, but that persecution has had lasting effects. These regions where heresy was the strongest, where the Inquisition was the strongest, they continue to be the poorest, more religious, less educated, and less trusting areas in Spain. That just gives you a sense of how powerful this entity was and how far its reach extended. If you were with them, if you had the mark of the beast, if you were cooperating, you could make good money. You could make a lot of money. But anybody who dissented was going to be put on the other side of things. And of course, we also see in this the profit that religion can bring. And by profit, I don't mean P-H-E-T, I mean F-I-T, profit. Religion is profitable. What does Peter say about false teachers in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 14 and 15? They have eyes full of adultery, and they cannot cease from sin, enticing unstable souls. They have a heart trained in covetous practices and are accursed children. They have forsaken the right way and gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of righteousness. We've talked about in the past how the Catholic Church was the largest landowner in Europe at one time. The Papal States, which we talked about a little bit last night, and other holdings enriched the Vatican's coffers. Monasteries and nunneries during the Middle Ages became very profitable. They were managed by a shrewd manager. They could do all sorts of things to make money. And I'm not just talking about like tithes and donations. I'm talking about actual commerce. They could make things. They could train horses, for example. They could have a dairy. The nunneries would make clothing for the nobility. These became very profitable enterprises. And of course, during this time, the church was living tax-free while demanding a tithe from parishioners. So you have money that's just corrupted this whole institution. And that's what Peter tells us to expect from false teaching. In chapter 18, verse number 15, continuing on commenting about Babylon, the merchants of these things who became rich by her will stand at a distance for fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, saying, Alas, alas, the great city that was clothed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing. Every shipmaster, all who travel by ship, sailors, and as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance and cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What is like this great city? They threw dust on their heads and cried out, weeping and wailing, and saying, Alas, alas, that great city, in which all who had ships on the sea became rich by her wealth. For in 1 hour she is made desolate. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. So what is promised in this is swift judgment. The world marveled at the beast in chapter 13, verse number 4. This beast was powerful, it was formidable, it was indomitable. And in verse number 18, that same sort of attitude, that same sort of admiration is being expressed by these merchants as they think back to what Babylon was and how much money they were making and how powerful they had become. In verses 8, 10, 17, and 19, we see that the judgment of God is very, very swift in either one day or 1 hour. And what I see in this is not only a swift judgment, but an unexpected judgment, something that would be a surprise, so to speak. And that, of course, just fits with what Jesus predicts about judgment. Usually the people who are surprised by judgment are the ones who are responsible for these sins. The master of the servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, and it is in an hour that he is not aware of. And that particular parable is important because it's talking about a servant in the house of this master. And that servant is beating his fellow servants. That, I think, depicts the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages and on into the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. So we see in these verses God's justice for her victims. Verse 13 says she trafficked in the bodies of souls of men. Verse 20 invites the heavens to rejoice over her. The apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. Remember, the Catholic Church was just a continuation of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, basically in the West, just morphed right into the Catholic Church. So God is holding this entire Latin system responsible for all the persecution of the church, beginning with the apostles and prophets and carrying down to the present day. And verse 24 says, in her was found the blood of prophets and saints and of all who were slain on the earth. Something that is also stated in chapter 17, verse number 6. And this just reminds us that this whole idea of Babylon, even though in this particular case it represents those who departed from the faith, who gave into apostasy, who have rebelled against God, that Babylon is bigger than just this particular manifestation. We're talking about the spirit of apostasy across all ages. Since, if you will, since the flood cleansed the earth, we're talking about a general spirit of rebellion against God. As Jesus says concerning the generation of Jews that he lived in Luke chapter 11, verses 50 to 51, he says, the blood of all the prophets, which was shed from the foundation of the world, may be required of this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the temple. Yes, I say to you, it shall be required of this generation. This is the same sort of idea that this spirit has manifested itself in Jerusalem as well, and Jesus holds them responsible, holds that spirit of rebellion responsible for the death of the righteous down through the centuries at the hands of others. All right, I am going to finish this chapter. I got 3 minutes. Here we go. Chapter 18, verse 21. Here we go. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, thus with violence the great city Babylon shall be thrown down and shall not be found any more. The sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpeters shall not be heard in you any more. No craftsman of any craft shall be found in you any more. The sound of a millstone shall not be heard in you any more. The light of a lamp shall not shine in you any more. And the voice of bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you any more. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, for by your sorcery all the nations were deceived, and in her was found the blood of the prophets and saints and of all who were slain on the earth. So God's judgment is final and decisive. Babylon shall not be found anymore, and we're going to see that later on in the 19th chapter. All signs of life are going to be extinguished, from musicians to artists to weddings. All of these things are going to cease. And that statement, by your sorcery, all the nations were deceived. We talked about back in chapter 13 how the Catholic Church has long claimed to continue to have miraculous powers. Even their celebration of communion, which they call the Eucharist, they believe that the priest miraculously changes the bread into the literal body of Jesus and the wine into the literal blood of Jesus. And that's the sorcery that we're talking about. It's the same sorcery, going back to chapter 13, verses 13 and 14, that the false prophet, the second beast, the papacy, also claims. He performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. He deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. All people were deceived by Babylon, even the wealthy and powerful. And yet the invitation still remains. Come out of her, my people. It is still possible for people today to realize what this system has been, what it continues to be. And if they'll just simply open their Bibles and study it, they can see for themselves that God's plan is simple and it's about the exact opposite of what they've been experiencing in their lives. So this is Babylon the Great, the mother of all harlots and abominations on the earth. I know that was pretty quick. I needed to get through those 2 chapters, though, to get to chapter 19. So my plan for the upcoming 2 nights, tomorrow night we'll cover chapter 19. And then on Thursday night we have the night that many of you have been waiting for. We're going to talk about chapter 20. And, we'll just see how the next 2 nights go. That may bleed a little bit over into Friday night, but my hope is to finish the book Friday night. We'll see how it goes. I think you're going to really enjoy chapters 19 and 20. I know I really enjoyed putting that study together. So I think tonight was probably the hardest night of the week. I got to admit, when I was putting this together, I thought I was feeling kind of sorry for these people because I knew it was going to be a lot of scripture, a lot of review, a lot of information. So I'm really glad Mark is streaming this for us so we can go back and watch these videos again. I need to ring the bell as I promised. All right, I'll throw it open real quick. Anybody have any questions? As the kids are coming up, we have probably maybe a minute or two if you have anything you'd like to discuss. I don't have my glasses on, so if I don't call you by name, just don't hold anything against me, please. Anybody got anything they want to say? All right. Well, feel free to approach me afterwards. I'm glad to answer any questions later. And email me, message me, text me, call me. Be glad to talk about any of this with you at any point down the road.